At heart, George Washington was a farmer. The relatively few years of Washington's later life, when he got to work on his land, were probably his happiest. Speaking of his farms, Washington said, "Nothing pleases me better than to see them in good order, and everything trim and handsome, and thriving about them, nor nothing hurts me more than to find them otherwise." After resigning his military commission in 1783 and before being inaugurated as president in 1789, Washington returned to farming. He was regularly visited by admirers looking for grand tales of the war. Much to their disappointment, Washington spent most of the time talking about his land and his plans to improve his farms and gardens. Known as a great intellect, the young John Adams loved hunting and the simple act of firing a gun. He even began carrying a gun to school so that he could hunt on his way home. He wasn't fond of learning. His parents had to force him to study. This was no easy task. At a young age, Adams was already very stubborn. His parents eventually won, however, and as an adult, all the way until his death, Adams' favorite hobby became reading. Since he was young, Thomas Jefferson loved music. He played the violin and cello, and his wife played the piano. They'd often play together. He also made friends with fellow founding father Patrick Henry over their shared love of the violin. James Madison was a skilled chess player and enjoyed playing against Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams. Unlike other early presidents, he didn't enjoy outdoor pastimes. In fact, he didn't enjoy many pastimes altogether. Even hobbies he had, such as reading, ultimately served towards his work. Like Madison, James Monroe spent most of his adult life consumed by work. His hobbies included horseback riding and hunting. John Quincy Adams was a man of rigorous routines. Part of his morning routine was skinny dipping. While living in Washington, Adams would wake up anywhere between 4 and 6 in the morning, walk down to the Potomac River, leave his clothes on a rock, and go for a swim. Quote, "I find it, as always, conducive to health, cleanliness, and comfort," Adams wrote in his diary. He'd usually swim for an hour or two, though sometimes he'd go for 3, trying to beat his own records. Others in politics noted how lean and fit Adams appeared, a striking contrast with his portly father. Adams was 50 years old when he began his daily swims in the Potomac while serving as Secretary of State to James Monroe, and at 79, 2 years before his death, he was still going for occasional swims. The hobbies of Andrew Jackson differed greatly from those of his elite peers. They included gambling on horse races and cockfights, and gambling in general. Whiskey was such a love of Jackson's that he even had his own distillery. Outside of watching horses race, he loved to horseback ride and even bred horses. To the disbelief of many, Jackson also enjoyed reading. He claimed that each day he read 3 chapters from the Bible. Martin Van Buren also loved horses. He and Jackson would horseback ride and watch horse races together. While horseback riding, they'd discuss national politics. William Henry Harrison was a military man, better known for his service in the military than in the political world, considering the shortness of his presidency. He also loved reading. By the time he was 17, he had read through Charles Rollin's Histories of Ancient Greece and Rome 3 times. He also enjoyed the historical military commentaries of Julius Caesar, which inspired his battlefield tactics. As a child, John Tyler enjoyed playing the violin, which his father had taught him. He'd even aspired to be a concert violinist, but upon beginning his law career, he stopped playing. After retiring from politics, he returned to the violin and enjoyed showing off his skills at parties. Politics was James K. Polk's whole life. He had no children, no pets, and at least during his presidency, no hobbies. Polk once said, "No president who performs his duties faithfully and conscientiously can have any leisure." This ethic has earned him the reputation among some historians as the only president to fulfill all of his campaign promises. It also may have killed him. Polk died less than 4 months after leaving office at age 53. Many historians say he worked himself to death. Zachary Taylor wasn't renowned for his intellectual curiosity, brilliance, or deep thinking. A lifelong military man, Taylor's defining traits were his calmness in the face of danger and the respect he earned from his troops. However, Taylor actually loved history. In his downtime, he could be found reading or having deep historical discussions with anyone willing to talk. As a child born into extreme poverty, Millard Fillmore developed an early habit of reading whenever he had the chance, as he saw this as his only way to move up in the world. This habit developed into a love that carried on all throughout his life. During his presidency, he and his wife established the first White House library. Franklin Pierce loved to socialize. With good looks, charisma, and excellent speaking skills, he was practically built for it. In his younger years, Handsome Frank, as he was called, would regularly spend his nights out on the town. James Buchanan didn't have any particular hobbies. A paper from 1859 describes his daily schedule. He rises early, reads the newspapers, breakfast, transacts business, takes a walk, dines plainly, receives visitors, and goes to bed at 10 o'clock. Socializing is perhaps where he excelled the most, as he was an excellent storyteller who took pride in his ability to hold his listeners captive for hours, only interrupted by the occasional question. The first 2 decades of Abraham Lincoln's life were wrought with manual labor and endless toil, and though he was incredibly strong and capable, he much preferred reading, taking every break from work to do so. He enjoyed everything from history books on George Washington to Aesop's fables to poetry. He not only loved reading poetry, but he wrote some of his own. One of his teenage writings reads, "Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with my pen I wrote the same. I wrote in both haste and speed, and left it here for fools to read." Early in life, Andrew Johnson had learned the trade of tailoring. It was the skill that would bring him out of poverty and earn him his early successes. He took great pride in his work, bragging about it in speeches, but it also gave him enjoyment. Even during his presidency, he would spend his free time sewing his own clothes. While at West Point Academy, Ulysses S. Grant was doubtful he would even graduate. Rather than studying his textbooks, Grant spent endless hours reading novels, so many that he couldn't even remember them all. He did, however, note that they were at least good novels and, quote, not those of a trashy sort. Genealogy was a favorite pastime of Rutherford B. Hayes. After receiving an incomplete family tree from a relative, he became obsessed with expanding it and filling in the blanks. In these days, genealogy wasn't a sedentary hobby. Hayes wrote letters, visited libraries, and traveled the country not only to find answers, but also to meet with distant relatives and learn about their lives. Hayes became so absorbed with the research process that he even began investigating the family background of his wife. In 1862, when James A. Garfield was serving as an Ohio congressman, he would spend his evenings playing chess against Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. The two would begin in the evening and would sometimes play until the late hours of the night, all the while discussing the events of the ongoing Civil War. Garfield was shaping up into a very skilled player, but realized he was becoming too absorbed. Therefore, he quit entirely. Chester A. Arthur was obsessed with his work, to such an extent that his family had to compete for attention during his free time. Even during his free time, however, Arthur devoted himself to his other obsession, fishing. There were many photos taken of Arthur during his fishing trips, many of which he undertook with political colleagues. Grover Cleveland enjoyed hobbies that hardly fit the high culture usually associated with the presidency, something akin to his party's founder, Andrew Jackson. He didn't travel, read, or particularly enjoy music. Instead, he socialized at Democratic organizations through drinking, partying, and poker. Benjamin Harrison was one of the most stiff and formal presidents. He hated small talk, rarely shook hands, and was unforgiving of incompetence. His coldness with Republican leaders was to such an extent that it even contributed to his loss in the 1892 election. With his family, Harrison was a different man. His children and their children lived in the White House. Harrison loved to play with his grandchildren. The time with his family was the only reprieve from a presidency he compared to a prison sentence. As a boy, William McKinley enjoyed a variety of hobbies, including swimming, ice skating, and shooting the bow and arrow. As an adult, he had little time for hobbies. When not working, he was attending to his sickly wife. In the evening, Ida would crochet while McKinley read poetry aloud. Theodore Roosevelt was more of a Renaissance man than any other president. His hobbies ranged from the physical, such as hiking, fishing, and jiu-jitsu, to the academic, such as writing about birds and history, to the creative, with his love of poetry and novels. Roosevelt was committed to getting the most out of life at every turn, and even his hobbies were pursued relentlessly. As he once said, "Never throughout history has a man who lived a life of ease left a name worth remembering." Though William McKinley was the first president to golf, William Howard Taft was the first to become known for it. "Golf in the interest of good health and good manners," Taft once said. "It promotes self-restraint and affords a chance to play the man and act the gentleman." Whether or not he learned restraint from golf is questionable. In 1908, he was running as the Republican presidential candidate, being the chosen successor of Theodore Roosevelt. In a letter, Roosevelt chastised Taft for being so focused on golf rather than his own campaign, and thought it was a terrible look. "I have received literally hundreds of letters from the West protesting about it," Roosevelt wrote. During his presidency, political opponents attacked him for golfing so much. His supporters maintained that it was necessary relaxation, but Taft did acknowledge he was addicted to the sport. Though he was America's most academic president, Woodrow Wilson loved sports. During his 8-year presidency, he attended 11 baseball games and played over 1,200 rounds of golf, playing more than any other president. Like Taft, he received criticism for this, but also like Taft, he didn't let it stop him. Wilson said of the sport, "Golf is a game in which one endeavors to control a ball with implements ill-adapted for the purpose." Perhaps this was reflective of his frustrations, as he could never really improve, despite how much he practiced. When it came to politics, Warren G. Harding wasn't very passionate. During his time in the Senate, he even missed a third of the votes. It was often his wife and ambitious men around him who pulled the strings. However, one area where he was quite passionate was baseball. He'd played in his youth and maintained an interest as an adult. He had, quote, "more than an academic interest in the game, and could score the game as neatly and concisely as any official scorer." During his 2.5-year presidency, Harding attended 5 baseball games. Calvin Coolidge loved horseback riding, but the busy life that comes with the presidency made it a difficult pastime to pursue. In the 3rd year of his presidency, he was gifted an electric horse, a stationary contraption designed to simulate the horse riding experience. Coolidge initially laughed so hard upon seeing it that he had to take a seat, but it would eventually become one of his favorite ways to exercise. Herbert Hoover didn't just enjoy fishing. He was a master of it. Other presidents such as Grover Cleveland, Calvin Coolidge, and Jimmy Carter also enjoyed fishing, but none were as good as Hoover. He had begun as a child and continued as an adult, learning the best ways to catch a variety of different fish. While not opposed to enjoying his hobby with others, he preferred to sit alone for hours, fishing and contemplating the problems he faced in his professional life. In 1963, a year before his death, he published a book on his favorite hobby, which contains the opening lines, "Fishing is a chance to wash one's soul with pure air, with the rush of the brook, or with the shimmer of the sun on the blue water. It is a discipline in the equality of man, for all men are equal before fish." Paralyzed from the waist down, Franklin D. Roosevelt was limited in what he could do with his downtime. Luckily for him, he loved stamp collecting, a hobby he'd begun when he was 8 years old. He used stamps as a starting place to learn about the various dignitaries and countries they featured. He even devised some stamp designs of his own. As president, He'd look through his stamp collection every night before bed as a way to relax. Harry S. Truman first learned the piano when he was 7. Every morning at 5 o'clock, he'd wake up early to practice, a habit he'd continue until he was 15, and only stopped because he needed to find work. But his love of music never ceased. I'm still very much interested in music and what it does for people. My daughter has some interest in music. My mother was very fond of music, and my father used to sing in the church choir, so I come by my love of music honestly. The Truman family's record collection eventually totaled 680. He liked classical music such as Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven, and not modern noise, as he called it. Truman was photographed playing the piano on many different occasions. One of these was in 1961, when the 77-year-old former president played at a White House dinner being held by President Kennedy. Dwight D. Eisenhower was 58 when he took up the hobby of painting. Over the next 20 years, his paintings would come to total 260. It was a way for him to relax. His subjects included his wife, grandchildren, and presidents such as Washington and Lincoln. One art historian described his work as simple and earnest, but Eisenhower didn't reflect so positively on it. Quote, "They would have this shit burned a long time ago if I weren't the President of the United States." John F. Kennedy would swim almost every day while president. The White House Museum states, quote, "John Kennedy sometimes held swimming races with cabinet members. He liked the pool so much that he made a habit of stopping by at noon, stripping down for a swim, and padding back to his bedroom for lunch and a nap in nothing but a robe. He did the same at the end of the day, dressing again for dinner." Back in Harvard, Kennedy had failed at football, thus he took to swimming instead. It was hard to tell with Lyndon B. Johnson what were genuine interest and what were just steps on the political ladder. Even from a young age, his interests, such as journalism, teaching, and student government, seemed to be more in the service of ambition rather than for their own sake. Family members noted how he would suddenly take interest in subjects such as Civil War history or baseball simply to get close to certain people. Once he made it to his end goal, the presidency, he did seem to enjoy spending time on his ranch. Over the course of his 5-year presidency, he made 74 visits to his ranch, spending a total of 490 days there, a quarter of his presidency. He especially enjoyed the escape, as in Washington, he faced ever-increasing criticism for the Vietnam War. A pillow in his study contained the quote, "This is my ranch, and I do as I damn please." Richard Nixon had a single-lane bowling alley installed in the White House basement. He would sometimes go there to relax after a day's work or even when he had small gaps in his busy schedule. While there are several photos and videos of Nixon bowling with a group, he generally preferred to bowl alone, as he preferred to do most things. Gerald Ford was mocked by the media for his lack of physical fitness after an incident in 1975 when he slipped while coming down the stairs of Air Force One. Ironically, Ford was one of the most physically active and fit presidents throughout his life and during his presidency. While in college, he played football, and upon graduating, he even received offers to play professionally. As president, he regularly lifted weights, played tennis, and swam in the White House pool. From a young age, Jimmy Carter had learned the trade of carpentry. Quote, "I grew up on a relatively isolated farm, long before we had electricity, and when all of the labor was by hand or with livestock. My father did the building and repairs, made many of our hand tools, and was a good cobbler and expert blacksmith. As soon as I was physically able, he expected me to do my share of the work, and I was an eager student." Carter did woodworking all throughout his life. While in the Navy, he spent his free time in the hobby shop building furniture for his family home. When Jimmy Carter left office in 1981, White House staffers purchased a gift certificate for a woodworking station as a parting gift. Carter set up the station in his garage and described it as, quote, "the most enjoyable gift I've ever received." Ronald Reagan is thus far the last president to be an experienced horse rider, and one of the few from the 20th century altogether. The early part of the century saw a number of horse-riding presidents, from Theodore Roosevelt to Warren G. Harding to Calvin Coolidge. However, that number dwindled, especially as automobiles became more common. Reagan had become an efficient horse rider for his acting career, and it was a hobby he continued to enjoy throughout his presidency, much to the dismay of the Secret Service tasked with protecting him. However, Secret Service agent John Barletta was also an experienced horse rider and thus had no problem keeping up with Reagan. The two formed a bond over their mutual hobby. George Bush loved playing horseshoes. Just months into his presidency, he had a new horseshoe pit set up on the White House grounds. According to one staffer, Bush would play to, quote, unwind, break the ice, do casual business, or just get the competitive juices flowing. Colin Powell, who served as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Bush, noted, he was competitive. If you tried to play horseshoes with him, you'll see how competitive he can be. One time, Bush heard trash talking from one of the renowned players at the White House, and thus challenged him to a duel. In less than 5 minutes, Bush won, 21-0. All throughout his life, Bill Clinton had a love of crossword puzzles. When I was president, I worked no telling how many hundreds and hundreds of crossword puzzles. I find it very relaxing. For a moment, you take your mind off of whatever you're doing. Clinton was known to complete 2 or 3 puzzles daily. In 1992, his campaign staffers presented him with an especially challenging puzzle. Clinton worked at it during an urgent phone conversation, yet finished in 6 minutes and 54 seconds. In his post-presidency, George W. Bush took up painting. Quote, painting has changed my life in an unbelievably positive way. Subjects of his paintings include world leaders, family members, dogs, and himself. He decided on picking up the hobby after reading Winston Churchill's essay, Painting as a Pastime. I decided I was going to paint. My attitude was that if Churchill can paint, I can paint. So I hired an instructor. She was a little apprehensive. She said, "What's your objective?" I said, "There's a Rembrandt trapped in this body, and your job is to find it." He remarked about the mundanity of growing old, and how, quote, you sit around with your pals, and there's really only 2 topics at conversation. What medicines are you taking? And how's your grandkids? Bush said he didn't want this mundane life, but wanted to continue to learn new things and live life to its fullest. Barack Obama is well known for the many physical activities he enjoys, from basketball to kite surfing to biking. However, Obama is also a fan of pop culture. He enjoys many modern television dramas, with his favorite being the HBO series The Wire, classic films such as Casablanca and The Godfather, and a variety of musical genres, one of his favorite artists being singer-songwriter Bruce Springsteen. Writing to supporters about his childhood interest, Obama said, quote, I grew up loving comic books. Back in the day, I was pretty into Conan the Barbarian and Spider-Man. Golfing is Donald Trump's favorite source of relaxation. Over his 4-year presidency, he visited golf courses over 280 times. He was criticized by the media for the time spent on the course. He responded by saying he played very fast and that it was his form of exercise. I know many in business and politics that work out endlessly, in some cases to a point of exhaustion. It is their number one passion in life, but nobody complains. My exercise is playing, almost never during the week, a quick round of golf. Worldwide, Trump owns 17 golf properties, and in 2019 spent $50,000 of his own money to have a room-sized golf simulator installed in the White House. All his playing has also paid off, as among all the presidents who've golfed, he's considered the best. Joe Biden has had a lifelong love of cars. His dad worked as a used car salesman and briefly served as an operations manager for Ford. Biden's passion was first sparked when his dad let him drive some of the vehicles. Biden got his first car when he was 19, and he was always eager to show it off. He would drive onto the college campus even though he wasn't allowed to. A particular 1967 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray holds special meaning to Biden as it was given to him by his father as a wedding gift. To this day, the Stingray remains his favorite in his collection. Biden shares the love of cars with his son Hunter, but when asked whether the two worked on cars together, Biden made it clear that while his family has always liked cars, they've never been mechanically inclined. The truth is, my dad was a great driver. I mean, he could handle an automobile. He loved speed. He used to joke that his one regret was that he didn't join the volunteer fire service so he could drive the ambulance. But we were never, motorheads. We knew fast cars, we knew how to siphon gas, charge the battery when it was down, but never hotwired a car. Today, Joe Biden still has a love of cars and receives iPhone notifications from automobile magazines. If you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy presidential family facts. To support the channel, consider subscribing or donating on Patreon. Patreon link in the description below.